Welcome back. Moscow has now responded to President Trump's announcement that he plans to meet with President Putin, with a Kremlin aide saying that meeting will take place in the coming days. The Trump administration has also been pushing for Ukraine's President Zelensky to be part of that summit. But in comments today, President Putin said certain conditions need to be met for him to meet with Zelensky, and those conditions are still far away. No formal date or location has been announced by either side. The push for talks comes as President Trump's deadline expires tomorrow for Russia to agree to some kind of ceasefire or face sweeping economic sanctions. And moments ago, we heard the president say Zelensky doesn't have to be a part of that meeting. Joining me now on set is Bill Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Ambassador Taylor, thank you so much for being here. Let's start right there. I think a lot of people's ears perked up when they heard President Trump say that Zelensky doesn't necessarily have to be a part of that meeting. What did you make of that? Were you surprised to hear that?
I was, Kristen. I was surprised because that's not what the White House had put out earlier. The White House had said that in order to have that meeting, President Putin would have to agree to meet with President Zelensky. And that's a good idea. That's been an idea that White Houses, that administrations have used, which is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So Ukraine needs to be there to be part of that discussion if they're going to be talking about Ukraine.
And what would you anticipate from such a meeting if Ukraine were to be a part of it? Who would have the leverage going into that meeting, given the fact that President Trump did just ramp up the amount of military assistance the U.S. is giving to Ukraine?
President Trump clearly has the leverage. President Putin wants this meeting. He wants this meeting. As you've indicated, as you reported, President Putin is an indicted war criminal. He wants to get some credibility back. He wants to be admitted back to the table. And President Trump has said, yes, he'll be willing to do that. That surprised a lot of people, but that's what he wants to find a way to end the war, which is a good thing. However, as you say, President Zelensky needs to represent that side of the discussion.
Both sides want certain things that we have sort of publicly heard about in order for there to be any ceasefire agreement. From the perspective of Russia, we've heard them talk about, obviously, Crimea, but then the Donbass region. We've also heard Ukraine talk about the desire to join NATO. Do you anticipate those sorts of asks will be on the table in any discussion?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. I think the discussion will focus on a ceasefire. The ceasefire is doable. That's achievable. President Zelensky and President Trump agreed on a ceasefire a couple of months ago, took it to President Putin. Putin said no. But that idea of a comprehensive ceasefire, air, land, and sea, that would stop the killing, this is what President Trump has been talking about. That could be done. Then these other issues, NATO, territory, compensation, reparations, all of those things, that can come. But those are long-term discussions.
And in terms of what the threat that President Trump made, basically, if there's not a ceasefire by this week, he's prepared to impose secondary sanctions against Russia, now saying in those remarks in the Oval Office, that's going to be up to President Putin. We'll have to hear what he has to say, giving yet more wiggle room there to see how any potential talks could play out. What did you make of that? And does that in any way undercut the president's hand by taking those sanctions to some extent off the table for now?
For now. So he has already put sanctions on India, who buys a lot of Russian oil.
Right.
So that part, or put tariffs on India. So that part is there. He has also provided Ukraine with weapons, which he hadn't done before. And those American weapons through NATO allies are really important message, first of all, to the Ukrainians so they can defend themselves, but also a message to Putin that the United States is going to continue to support Ukraine militarily. So that part of the message still exists. The question of timing of these other tariffs or other sanctions does sound a little more flexible at this point.
Let me ask you about some new poll numbers that we are getting out, and we should caveat this, Ambassador Taylor, by saying it's incredibly difficult to poll in a conflict zone. But this is a Gallup poll of Ukrainians' views of the war, and you can see there that support for the war has dropped. It shows after 3 years that it's hit a record low, in fact. And while support for a negotiated end to the war is at an all-time high. What do you make of those numbers?
Kristen, Ukrainians are tired, you said.
Yeah.
They've been fighting for 3.5 years against the Russians. And it's not just the soldiers. The whole society is united and working and is tired. They do want an end to this war. There's no doubt about it. They don't want to give up territory. They know that these negotiations are possible that will give them a ceasefire. And then, as I say, then the discussions of these other things can happen. So the Ukrainians do want an end to the war, no doubt about that. That has increased, but that has to happen on a just and lasting peace.
Whenever you and I talk, I always ask you this question, but I do think it's so important for our viewers. Can you update us on what this war looks like right now on the ground? What is the reality of where this fighting stands?
The reality is on the ground that the Russians are grinding little bit by little bit, piece by piece, meter by meter at great expense. But they are grinding forward. And then the question is, what happens to the Ukrainians? The Ukrainians are shooting deep into Russia at military targets, trying to stop that advance, stop the support, the ammunition, the fuel that comes in. So those are the military targets that the Ukrainians are going after with great success. But on the ground, the Russians are grinding forward. The Russians have actually been effectively defeated, stopped on the sea. And then in the air, it's an advantage for the Russians because they've got bombs and missiles and drones. The Ukrainians are smarter and quicker, but the Russians have more.
Ambassador Taylor, we always appreciate your perspective on this ongoing war that we continue to track so closely. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kristen.
Appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.